I too didn't want to have this conversation today, in part because some of the most ridiculous and abusive emails and phone calls I've ever had have been around this conversation over the last year. When I opened the conversation and last time we had a motion regarding this, I had just come within the week from being at the pre-graduation, pre-convocation gala dinner at the Atlantic School of Theology, and Dr. Marie Wilson, who'd been one of the three Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, had spoken. And, you know, to come from a room where people of multiple denominations and different religions had gathered at the Lord Nelson to listen to this woman talk about how reconciliation is an ongoing effort of will and it's work that we'll be doing for the rest of our lives and our children's lives, and seeing them all nod and agree, yep, this is a lot of work. We're going to have to do this work, and then to come in here and not be able to continue that work was crushing. I unequivocally support this motion, and I'm glad, in retrospect, that Councillor Cleary brought this up. I'm not afraid to have this discussion. I want to say, especially to the newer councillors and those that have rejoined us, I want to remind people this has been an ongoing discussion since we had our first meeting to talk about renovating the playground at Cornwallis Park on May 28th, 2014, and where we had 200 people who showed up and wanted to talk about changing the name of the park. And we were going through a process, and we were talking, we were having meetings, we were working with academics, we were meeting at St. Mary's, but where the rubber really hit the road was when the Premier, at the urging of Alan McMaster, the Conservative MLA, that Stephen McNeil said we should have a discussion about this in the House in December of 2015. And then in that same month, this council passed its Truth and Reconciliation resolution. You know, I want to point out that truth and reconciliation on a municipal level is something that's been embraced by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in June of 2015 and by the big city mayors. This is something other municipalities are engaging in, and frankly, they're engaging in it more rigorously than HRM has to this point. I think that has to change. I reject utterly the statement that you can't change history. History changes all the time. If you think it doesn't, you're dead wrong. If you read the Metro article from this weekend that Brett Bundale, and I'd like to acknowledge he's in the audience today, back working for Canadian Press, wrote, she does an interview with John Reid, Professor Emeritus at St. Mary's, where he talks about how Cornwallis was not even recognized until 100 years. Over 100 years later. It says that nearly 100 years later, the idea of Cornwallis as the founder of Halifax surfaced. Cornwallis is a pretty minor historical character, says the professor, noting Cornwallis was reinvented throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century of imperialism. The essence of it to me is whether Cornwallis was a nice or nasty figure, he said. He was not a successful governor. Cornwallis was forgotten until his reinvention as a vehicle for the reassertation of this kind of imperial identity, British imperial identity. So other nations have struggled with this. I've seen John Reid speak and other professors speak at an event held by the Gorsberg Institute some time ago on these issues, on commemorating, changing the commemoration of historical landscapes or artifacts where the history has changed and people's feelings toward them has changed. One of the speakers at that meeting, I think it might have been Professor Reid, talked about how there are plenty of examples in the Western world of where statues have been removed or plaques have been changed. Germany is very good at this. And I'm not saying that strictly for emotional weight or whatever, but they have a very checkered past, and they're very good at saying, should that statue stay? And if it does, how are we going to put it in a context that explains why we've let it stay there? So that is a conversation that we need to be willing to have. We've been asked by members of our community, not just the Mi'kmaq community, but primarily by them, to talk about Cornwallis Street and to talk about this park and talk about this statue, talk about these commemorations. And I think we should listen to those people and that we should have that discussion. We're not talking about making a decision about the ultimate end today, but we're talking about having a discussion. I'm tired of getting emails and phone calls from white men of privilege who say we should not have this discussion. Okay? I'm not prepared to say today that I'm not going to have that discussion just because I'm uncomfortable having that discussion, or some people in the community are uncomfortable having that discussion. We are all treaty people. Let's be brave and let's have that discussion. Thank you.